welcome to another ES for Business and Life video. Today we're going to be checking Unit 3 for our book Market Leader for Pre-Intermediate Students. Don't forget that the name of the unit is called Selling. And also we'll be covering the grammar for this unit. Let's begin. Today we'll talk about modals for obligation, necessity, and how to give recommendations. For obligation, we have the auxiliaries must, need to, and have to. For necessity, we'll use need to and have to. And for recommendations, we'll use should. Let's start. Okay, so an obligation is something that is necessary to do, something that is not only your responsibility, but it's also that it's a must, something necessary, obligatory. For this, we're going to be using the auxiliaries must, need to, and have to. We have three examples. Example number one, we have you must wear a tie at work, or you need to wear a tie at work, or finally, you have to wear a tie at work. We'll analyze this further a little bit more here. Okay, the formula in affirmative is quite simple. We need a subject, we need the expression need to, and we need also the verb in simple form. Always after need to or have to, we have to use a verb in simple form, as well as a complement, something that will complete our idea. If we use have to, we use the same formula, but we only include have to if necessary. We have an example here. She has to file all reports by tomorrow. It is her obligation to complete the files, to complete the reports on time, that time being tomorrow. Don't forget that if you use he, she, or it, you're going to use has to, and if it's need to, you will need to say needs to. That is very important. Now, the affirmative for the auxiliary must, it is quite the same, but instead we're not going to have the preposition to. It is not necessary in this case, and if you use it, it's going to be incorrect. Let me erase that. And we have the formula subject, the auxiliary must, the verb in simple form, and the complement. And we have an example. We must report any problems to Mr. Johnson. It is our obligation to report whatever situation happening with Mr. Johnson here. Okay, now using the negative is also quite simple and easy. The formula, first off, we need to remember that it is only for have to and need to. Must in negative expresses something different. So must only in affirmative for now. The formula is subject, don't or doesn't, depending if it's the first or the third person, have to or need to, and the verb in simple form as well as a complement. We have an example. We don't have to work on Sunday. We don't have to work on Sunday. So we have the subject, we have the auxiliary, in this case don't, we have the expression have to, we have the verb in simple form, and we have our complement. Now, to make questions, it is just exactly as we would say it or use it in the simple present. We have the auxiliary does or do, depending if it's the first or the third person. We have the subject, the expression need to, the verb in simple form, and finally the complement. Examples: do you have to send it tonight? Do you have to send it tonight? Auxiliary, subject, expression for obligation, send, verb in simple form, and the complement. Another example, we have what does she need to bring for the meeting? What does she need to bring for the meeting? In this case, we have a question word because it's an information question. We have the auxiliary, the subject, the expression, And finally, the verb in simple form with its complement. More examples. We have, they have to buy more supplies for the office. Example number 2, you must bring that contract signed ASAP. The expression ASAP stands for as soon as possible. You can also use it in capital letters. You can also say ASAP. Alright, third example, he needs to talk to the boss about his pay. His pay meaning his salary. And once again, if you want to check it out, we follow the formula. We have the subject, we have the expression or modal auxiliary, we have verb in simple form buy, verb in simple form bring, and verb in simple form talk. And well, the complement for more supplies for the office, that contract signed, and to the boss about his pay. Now, giving recommendations, we're going to be using the auxiliary should. We have, don't forget that the expression should means it's a good idea. And also, should, when you say the word, don't pronounce the O or the L. So if we remove this and remove this, the result is should. The sound, the U and the D. Because sometimes people say should, and that is not correct. Make sure you do not say the L. Okay, now we have affirmative, negative, and question. It's very easy, very simple. We have, in affirmative, you should sign with GM. You should sign with GM. We have a subject, we have the auxiliary, and we have the verb in simple form. If it's a negative, we're just going to include the negative, which is the contraction nt or not. You shouldn't sign with GM. You shouldn't sign with GM. Subject, auxiliary negative, and the verb in simple form. And if we want to make a question, the only thing we do is we invert the elements, the first two elements, which are the subject and the auxiliary, and we say, should I sign with GM? Should I sign with GM? Don't forget to include the question mark as well as the intonation rise there. Let's move on now. There are some differences. For example, we have, you should use formal language at all times. You should use formal language at all times. This means it's a good idea. It's a good idea to speak correctly all the time, but it's not an obligation or a necessity. In the second case, you have to use formal language at all times. Have to indicates that it's an obligation. Remember, if we don't comply with an obligation, there will be consequences, like maybe losing your job or having problems with clients or co-workers. Another difference that we can find with this, remember that I told you that must in negative means something else? For example, we have, you don't have to wear a tie on Saturdays. You don't have to wear a tie on Saturdays. Remember that wearing a tie is part of the dress code. The dress code in a company refers to the way you dress, the type of clothes that you wear at work. Like wearing a suit, a shirt, formal shoes, etc., and a tie. So this means that on this day of the week, it's not necessary for you to wear a tie. Maybe the rest of the week you have to, but not on Saturdays. However, if we say you mustn't leave any doors unlocked when you leave, you mustn't leave any doors unlocked when you leave. If you use must not or mustn't, this means there's a prohibition. It's prohibited. it's not possible for you to do that. If you do it, there will be very bad consequences, like then again maybe losing your job or having problems with the boss. Before saying thank you, let's go back to what we are doing today. Don't forget, the unit is called Selling for you, pre-intermediate student, and we covered the grammar of the day. We talked about three things: obligation, necessity, and recommendations. Obligation and necessity being very similar, and a recommendation meaning it's a good idea. Don't forget that only for recommendations we're going to use the expression or the modal auxiliary should. Obligation, must, need to, and have to. Affirmative, negative, and questions as well. We saw some examples. We don't forget that the pronunciation, don't say the O, don't say the L, and the result is should. We have some examples, very easy. Subject, auxiliary, verb in simple form. If it's a question, just make that inversion of elements. Don't always forget that it's very important to know what you're saying, if you're saying it's a good idea or it's your obligation to do something. There are some differences too, like don't have to means it's not necessary, and mustn't, which is it's not possible or it's prohibited. Well, once again, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we see each other in another level. Remember that practice leads to mastery. Good practice will lead you to knowing a lot about the topic in question. And please never stop learning and push yourself. Always challenge yourself and expose yourself to difficult situations so that you learn from those experiences. Goodbye. See you on our next video.